So what if the path to a truly meaningful life isn't about, finding inner peace? What if it's about picking a much, much bigger fight? Today, we're going to dive into this really challenging idea from historian Rutger Bregman. He calls it moral ambition. And honestly, it's a concept that's totally shaking up how we think about success. It sparked this huge debate about how we should spend our lives. So, let's get into what moral ambition actually means and why it might just change how you think about your own life's work.
Yeah, Bregman does not start with some comforting, you're doing great kind of mantra. No, he throws down the gauntlet right away with this quote. His point is, in a world that's facing some pretty massive crises, the goal shouldn't just be to be fine with yourself. The real goal, to become a force for actual change in the world. This isn't your typical self-help book. It's a call to arms.
Okay, so what's the big problem here? Why such a radical call to arms? Well, Bregman frames it as this huge modern tragedy, a crisis of completely wasted human potential.
80,000 hours. That's it. That's the average amount of time you spend working in your entire life. Think about that. It's the one resource we have that is absolutely 100% non-renewable. You can't get it back. So Bregman asks this really simple but profound question. What are we doing with all that time? And is it actually making any kind of real difference?
Because he argues, a huge chunk of that time is spent on what the anthropologist David Graeber famously called bullshit jobs. And look, this isn't some outsider just pointing fingers. The key thing here is that this feeling, it comes from the inside. It's the employees themselves who have this nagging suspicion deep down that their work doesn't really contribute anything meaningful to society.
Do you know, this feeling of meaninglessness, it's not spread out evenly at all. The data shows this really stark divide. You've got firefighters and nurses where basically 0% of them think their job is pointless. Of course not, right? But then you look at fields like marketing and PR, and suddenly more than a fifth of the people working in them feel like their jobs are socially meaningless. It kind of suggests we've built this economy that throws tons of money at work that many people find hollow, while at the same time, we're undervaluing the jobs that have really clear, tangible benefits for all of us. And this right here, this shows exactly where our best and brightest are ending up. Bregman points out that almost half of all Harvard graduates get funneled into what he calls the Bermuda Triangle of talent. That's finance, consulting, and corporate law. It's just a massive brain drain, pulling people away from solving the world's biggest problems and sticking them in industries that he argues are often more about extracting value from the system than actually creating it.
So if that's the diagnosis, this massive waste of talent, then what's the cure? Well, Bregman proposes this whole new model for what a successful life could look like. It's one that fuses two qualities that we usually think of as being completely separate. He calls it moral ambition. And the idea here isn't to just be a selfless activist to avoid success or some ruthless entrepreneur who couldn't care less about ethics. No, it's a hybrid. It's about combining the soul of an activist with the drive and ambition of an entrepreneur to go after the biggest challenges of our time.
Okay, that sounds great in theory, right? But how do you actually do it? Well, Bregman argues that the first step is to unlearn all the bad habits that so often hold do-gooders back from making a real difference.
He calls these the myths of the noble loser. And they're basically these common beliefs that, sure, they make us feel good about our efforts, but in the end, they really limit our effectiveness. Things like, thinking that just raising awareness is enough to solve a problem, or that as long as your intentions are good, that's what counts, or the idea that you can only work with people who agree with you on absolutely everything.
I mean, just look at the British abolitionists. They didn't try to solve everything all at once. That's what he calls the synergy myth. Instead, they made a super pragmatic choice: focus only on the slave trade. It was a narrow, achievable first step, and that step built the momentum they needed to eventually abolish slavery itself. The goal was absolutely radical, but their method was relentlessly practical.
Okay, so if you manage to avoid those myths, where do you even point all that energy? Bregman suggests this really simple but powerful filter he calls the SSS framework. You should look for problems that are sizable, solvable, and sorely neglected. So problems that are huge, problems that we actually have the tools to fix, and, this is the crucial part, problems that almost everyone else is ignoring. That's the sweet spot. That's where you can have the biggest impact. And when you start using this framework, it can totally reframe your priorities. Let's take climate change, for example. Is it sizable? Yes. Is it solvable? Yes. But is it sorely neglected? No, not really. It gets a ton of attention. Now contrast that with something like biodiversity loss or factory farming. They're just as big, just as solvable, but they get a tiny fraction of the attention and resources. That's where Bregman says your 80,000 hours can make the biggest possible difference. But not everyone is sold on this. Bregman's vision has some really sharp critics, and they argue that his entire framework, while it sounds appealing, is actually built on a pretty dangerous and flawed understanding of how the world really works.
One of the strongest critiques comes from the economist Vladimir Surenko. He basically argues that Bregman's plan isn't some grassroots movement. It's a top-down, centralized utopia that's been designed by a handful of experts. And he says it fundamentally misunderstands where progress and prosperity actually come from.
Surenko points out that Bregman loves to focus his attacks on the flashy rich, the celebrities and the financiers with their super yachts. But he says this completely ignores the stealthy wealthy. These are the entrepreneurs running the vital, maybe unglamorous businesses that provide real value and jobs in their communities. We're talking about the person who owns the local factory that makes carpet machines. Surenko's point is that Bregman is attacking a caricature, not the messy reality of how wealth is actually created.
So Surenko's whole critique really boils down to this. Bregman puts all his trust in these top-down experts and big nonprofits, and he completely ignores the power of local businesses, churches, and communities. He seems to view wealth as this fixed pie that just needs to be sliced up and redistributed, not a pie that can actually grow for everyone. And as a kind of cautionary tale, Surenko points to Haiti, a country that is absolutely saturated with NGOs but remains deeply impoverished. It's a powerful suggestion that top-down charity just isn't the silver bullet Bregman seems to think it is.
So where does that leave us? Well, we've got two really powerful, totally competing visions for how to change the world. On one hand, you've got this idea of ambitious experts tackling huge neglected problems, and on the other, you have decentralized entrepreneurs building value from the ground up. So, what do we do with that?
Maybe the answer lies in something a little more fundamental than all these grand theories. There was a study of the heroes in the World War II resistance. These were people who risked their own lives to hide others from the Nazis. The researchers looked for a common trait. Were they rich, poor, young, old? They couldn't find any pattern, except for one really surprising factor.
And what they found reveals this really profound truth. Moral courage isn't some mystical quality that you're just born with. In the vast majority of cases, these heroes acted for one simple reason. Someone asked them for help. That's it. They were just ordinary people who rose to an extraordinary occasion simply because they were given an invitation to be brave.
So in the end, the whole debate really comes down to this one question. Is moral ambition a practical, vital new guide for changing the world? Or is it a dangerous fantasy of centralized control, a road to a well-intentioned but really flawed utopia? The answer to that question might just determine how an entire generation decides to spend their 80,000 hours. So the only question left is, what are you going to build with yours?